You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Back here live on the 4th of July, 2026. It's Paul Shivari filling in for Edwin Eisendrath. It's the Democracy, Stupid. And it is our democracy here that we are looking at in 2026. Is it healthy? Is the State of the Union healthy? What is this country? I'm going to talk to Kevin Schultz in just a moment. You're going to hear that. But I want you to keep in mind that as soon as that conversation is over, we're going to hit a break. And when we come back from that, you will have the opportunity to call me, 773-763-9278. There's already been some people that have been on the text line. One of our listeners did not like the Ronald Reagan conversation. And look, I'm not trying to praise Reagan. All I was saying is if it was between Reagan and Trump, I would take Reagan. But obviously it's the lesser of two evils, and we're talking about very evil. And if we're talking about the health of the nation and divisive presidents, I think Reagan was just way more of a peaceful president than Donald Trump would ever be. But as far as presidents go, no, I'm not endorsing Ronald Reagan. So I just wanted to clear that up to that person that hit us up on the text line. But you can also participate as well, 773-763-9278, 773-763-WCPT. But now I want you to listen to my conversation with Kevin Schultz. He's a history professor and the chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I was able to talk to him earlier this week, and we kind of looked at things from a historical lens, where the country kind of came from, what it is now, what it could look like in the future, parallels that we might have seen before, what the hope is to keep this country around so that we can celebrate it for more time and leave it in a good space when we leave this world. And I'm happy that I got to talk to him. So after that, please call in and let's keep the dialogue going. Here on It's the Democracy, Stupid with Edwin Eisendrath. Paul Shivari filling in for Edwin today on the 4th of July, the 250th anniversary of this country's founding. And I'm glad to be joined today by Dr. Kevin Schultz. He's the chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's an award-winning historian and as well as an author. Joins me today to talk about the United States and where we are at this point in time in this stage of the game. Professor Schultz, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Paul. Happy 250th to the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, thank you. And likewise to you, too. So in your own words, what's the state of the union these days as we celebrate our 250th?
I obviously am worried about the state of American democracy, and I'm concerned about the idea that the ideals that were put forward in the Declaration, that all men are, men back in the day, human beings today is how we would understand that, are provided, endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our nation for 250 years has been a constant struggle to live up to those ideals. So I am a little worried at this particular moment. I think like many, many, many Americans, basically every American that's not part of that 20% MAGA core is worried about the fate of democracy right now. But I also, with my historian lens on, know that the United States has been through trials and tribulations in the past. And this is another Gilded Age. Well, we had a Gilded Age 125, 150 years ago, and we saw all sorts of corruption and kleptocracy on the floor of Congress and in the White House. So this is a time with historical precedents, and it's just a grab bag of historical precedents that we're pulling from. So I'm not particularly worried about the fate of our democracy to survive as long as we have a strong, knowledgeable citizenry that is willing to fight. And so even though I'm concerned about some of the things I see happening, I see the fight in the American people. I see the No Kings rallies that are going on. I see what's happened in Minneapolis to go and protest the violation of our constitutional rights. So I think there will be a strong and lasting preservation of our democracy. But I've said many times that it's going to be a slog. So it's going to be it's a long time coming. It's not one thing that's going to all of a sudden be fixed, and it's going to be a slug. It's going to be something we have to slug out and fight for. And I do think Americans have been progressively waking up, and the circle of Americans that are aware of the dangers to our democracy is growing. And I do think that we're going to rely and fall back on the ideals that were put forward in our Declaration of Independence and embodied in our Constitution. As flawed as that history has been, I do sense I'm the hope guy. People always bring me in to talk about hope. And I am hopeful. And I use my historical knowledge to say, hey, we've seen some of this before.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because this isn't a unique situation. It's just unique to this moment. And what were some of the things that were successful in the past to kind of quell some of these uprisings that we're seeing right now with the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, if you go back 150 years to some of the initial labor revolts, we're sort of in a similar battle to what they were in now during their industrial revolution, as you might remember from your high school history classes, this mammoth growth in factories and industrial production that completely changed the way of life. I mean, this is the invention of electricity and light bulbs. So imagine today your life without electricity and light bulbs. How transformative have those things been? Much less televisions and telephones. Those all came later. But we saw during the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century that large oligarchs wanted to control their industries with ruthless measures and keep workers down and be able to maximize their own profits and line their pockets and butter up politicians by paying massive campaign contributions or giving them outright bribes on the floor of Congress sometimes to sitting vice presidents sometimes. This is the great credit mobilier scandal of the 1870s. And what pushed that back was a couple things. The people just resisting and saying, no way, this is corrupt. And the Declaration of Independence was passed to prevent kings from dictating what happens to individual people that is now the country of the United States. Now we have new kings. They're the oligarchs. And how can we organize to push those people from limiting our liberty? How can we prevent the wealthiest classes from limiting what we Americans do? And they pushed back. They organized. They used massive protests in the same way that we're seeing now. I mean, you look at the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and this was a violent protest. Literal protesters were uprooting the tracks of railroads so the railroads could not go across the country. And a railroad connects the country. So if they started uprooting railroad tracks, that had long-lasting effects that went to St. Louis, and then it went to Chicago, and then it went to San Francisco. So this became a nationwide kind of strike. I think back just to the 50 years ago, to the 1970s, when there were all sorts of gas spikes going on because of turmoil in the Middle East. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah.
What happened then? Truckers stopped their trucks in the middle of freeways. They said, no, we have to fix this problem. So the American people have always fallen back on activism. And then they've turned that activism into demanding better from their politicians. And they've demanded that the far left, the more radical left, make concessions with the centrist liberals. And they've demanded and pushed the centrist liberals to make concessions beyond what they were comfortable for. And they ended up isolating the conservatives, which we're actually watching now as more and more people sort of that we might think of as old school Reagan Republicans are falling away from the MAGA movement. And they're recognizing that that's a marginalized idea in American life. And they brought together the sort of center of American politics and the far left of American politics, and they pushed for radical change. So to bring you back to your high school history classes, you might remember the early socialist movement of Eugene Debs, or you might remember the populist movement of farmers revolting against the imposition of railroad restrictions and things done by the oligarchs. They came together and demanded radical changes. The working class wanted the means of production to go into the hands of the workers. And then you had the progressive era, the other thing you might remember from your high school period. And that was sort of the more middle class urbanites, the educated urban dwellers. And they said, holy cow, if we don't do something, we're going to end up in a revolutionary period. We need to move the politics of our country to the left. We need to take power away from the oligarchs. We need to have things like direct election of senators, so it's not bought and backroom deals to have who's governing us like it was before the direct election of senators. We need to have a greater electorate, so let's bring women and give women the ballot. So in 1920, women earn the right to vote in federal elections. So is this coming together of this mass of Americans who are responding to all of this groundswell of protest, and they ended up pushing the country further to the left than it certainly was in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. They created a regulatory state that did not allow the federal government or senators or members of House Representatives to try and work in cahoots with the sort of grand industrialists, the robber barons as they're sometimes called. And so then we created this state that would service and serve at behalf of the good for all Americans. It actually had a vision of what a common good can be. And I think those things have continued. The ideals that undergird those movements, the notion that we're celebrating in our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is still there, that all Americans deserve access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we need to stand up as a collective people and demand that the people who govern us do a good job, and they actually are responsive to the common good as opposed to just serving the interests of the 1%.
So if my timeline is correct here with the progressive movement of the early 20th century, this was Theodore Roosevelt going against the robber barons, being the trust buster. I see sort of similarities in the sense that with the consolidation of some of the corporations that we're seeing nowadays, the fact that also we have our first trillionaire in Elon Musk, that we're kind of in this era sort of again, who's going to be our Teddy Roosevelt and how can we regulate some of these corporations? I mean, I know they're not having the monopolies that we saw, 140 years ago or so, but it seems like we're trending back in that direction with the consolidation of power, that they want that sort of large monopoly again.
I mean, it's a great question. And if I had the answer, I would go on one of these gambling apps that you can now spend all your money on and bet on the success of that person. I don't know who it will be. I do know right now we are witnessing a titanic battle within the Democratic Party. And it's sort of a civil war in ways because it's constructed of two parties, or two components, let's put it that way. One component are the more centrist Democrats, the sort of abundance liberals that Ezra Klein has sort of named, and they sort of want to take down the regulatory state and allow things to be easier for businessmen so that we can end our housing problem by building more housing and having less regulations so that we don't have to pause and think about how people in wheelchairs might be able to access certain apartment buildings or things like that regulators actually mandate builders do, for instance. And this one is more in bed with the financial industry. And this one sort of wants to see a rising tide raises all boats kind of thing. That's sort of the center of the Democratic Party. And it's been represented very well by many members of the Democratic Party. They don't sit very comfortably, and fewer of them are claiming it outright. But certainly that was, we can think back to Bill Clinton talking about the era of big government being over. And he sort of proposed what he called historically in 1992, the third way, which was I'm going to be socially liberal and economically conservative, because he wanted to have, fewer borders and allow capital to move more freely across borders, something we today know of as neoliberalism. He sort of wanted to usher in that kind of economics because he thought computers and technology was the wave of the future, which it was, but it had all these horrible effects that we're now living with today. So that's one side of this civil war that we're seeing in the Democratic Party. The other side is represented, most sort of charismatically today by Zoran Mamdani, who's taken the mantle from Bernie Sanders and maybe Elizabeth Warren even, and it's the Democratic Socialists, the Social Democrats, depending on if you're in Europe or in the United States, which way you want to call that. And that's a group that is certainly on economic matters to the left of those centrist Democrats. Maybe on social issues, they might not be as far to the left, but that's sort of an open question. I do know that the Social Democrats are getting pretty good at not wanting to talk about identity politics, not wanting to talk about Israel as much, Israel-Palestine conflict, because what they want to talk about are bread and butter issues that affect all of Americans except for the top 1%. So I do think that right now we're seeing the tide shifting towards those social democrats. I don't know who is going to rise up among them to be sort of the person who's carrying the flag. I do want some credit, though. I do want some credit. I wrote a book a year ago. It was called Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals. And it's a 100-year history of uses and abuses of the word liberal and liberalism. And I end the book by saying, look, liberalism and owning the libs, it's become too easy for the conservative and right-wing people to take advantage of that language. So we need to give up the language of libs and liberalism and concede that it's gone. Not necessarily the ideas that were central to it. But I did say that some words that might be on the rise is democratic socialism. I thought that would take, so I wrote that 2 years ago. The book came out a year ago, and now here's what we're seeing. So I want a little bit of credit. I'm not saying I made it happen. I'm just saying that I might have seen it coming a little bit.
I was going to say, I mean, it's it's been kind of bubbling up for a while that the Democratic Socialist movement within the party lately. I mean, just with the recent victories out in New York in the primary races and Mamdani-backed candidates winning, has kind of freaked out not only the right, of course, but even within its own party, you start seeing some of those centrist Democrats kind of afraid of what the future of the party holds. But I don't know where I'm going with this, but essentially, it's crazy to how many conservative penned op-eds I've seen lately that are afraid of this movement, that it's, socialist, it's communist, it's this. Do you see parallels, though, of this democratic socialist movement with the socialist movement of the early 20th century?
What I will say, so yes, in some ways, what I will say is that the Democratic Party has been the most successful. It has been at its most successful in passing legislation that is good for the social welfare of the country. The New Deal, for instance, even the Great Society, and going back to the era that you're asking about, this progressive era, when it has been able to carry facets of the sort of farther left components, the Social Democrats or the Socialist Party of the United States, as it was called 150 years ago, and the more centrist Democrats. When those two are able to find common cause and battle with themselves and then collectively put forward legislation, the Democratic Party has been by far at its most successful. When they are at odds and when they battle with each other and do not allow legislation to move forward, when they don't make compromises with one another, let's put it that way, that's when the conservative movement has tended to grow, and then they dominate the legislation that comes through and is signed into law. So I think one of the things that we will watch, and we are watching it now with all of these 2028 presidential contenders, they're being very careful. A guy like Gavin Newsom or Wes, what's his last name?
Wes Moore.
Wes Moore.
Maryland.
I said Wes Morton is where it was, but Wes Moore from Maryland. They're being very, very careful and not taking sides on either of these sort of, are you a centrist Democrat or are you to the far left? And I think that's actually a good sign, because I think what they're recognizing is that on economic issues, more than 80% of Americans think that the 1% is too wealthy. And more than 80% of Americans want some version of economic redistribution. They don't know exactly what that looks like, and there's not a lot of agreement there. But the American population is far left when it comes to economic redistribution. They're less decided on what that actually might look like. But on other social issues, like should we have borders, the American population is, yes, we should have borders. We should also increase pathways to citizenship. We should also defund ICE and not turn it into a military force in our streets that are terrorizing populations. There should be ways that the 14th Amendment should be upheld, which of course this week it just was. So thank you, Supreme Court, even though that should have been a unanimous decision and it wasn't. But nonetheless, it was still upheld. Birthright citizenship I'm talking about right now. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's really interesting for us in this moment to watch our leading politicians in the Democratic Party not eagerly take a stand on one side or the other in this civil war that is going on. And I take that to be a good sign, because they're trying to negotiate between the two. And when the Democratic Party historically has been able to work with both sides of its more radical fringe and its more conservative fringe, that's when they've been the most successful.
Every election cycle, you hear that this is the most important election coming up. And we know that the midterm elections of 2026 will reflect on what the Trump administration is doing this time around and how the radical changes that they're trying to do here. But I'm looking at 2028, and I think the looming dinosaur in the room is, will Trump run for yet another election? And at this time, it would be horribly unconstitutional. How do you think that would play out if he decides to throw his hat into the ring without having that amendment being changed that he'd be allowed for a third term?
I mean, I
know it's a loaded question, but yeah. I know it's something that I think, like, if he's still around in 2 years, I feel like it's going to be faced head on.
Look, in the United States, I have all sorts of beliefs myself, but I know we're a pluralistic, dynamic nation. And so sometimes the conservative factions are going to have more strength, and sometimes our more radical factions are going to have more strength. And that's sort of what democracy is, for better or for worse. And so when I'm watching the Trump administration, Trump 2.0 especially, do what it does, the things that I'm really consciously and carefully watching are the structures and dynamics of democracy. How does it work in practice? How does voting work in practice? And as long as democracy can function, I think that then we will be fine and maybe we get what we deserve. But when there are these efforts that we are watching, actually, most of the time the courts are pushing back on them, not all of the time. A lot of the states are demanding their rights. We saw in Indiana, a bunch of state legislators push back against Trump's attempt to do redistricting. Trump pushed and fought back, but it was too late. So I'm watching a lot of this sort of messing with democracy, and that's where my sort of the tingling, my spider senses sort of get activated, because I want to make sure we still have the democracy that we love and were promised by our founding documents. There is a way I can see Trump running for president in 2028. He would have to declare some national emergency and say this is not a regular time, and so therefore I'm able to usurp the laws that prevent a president from running for a third term, which were put in place in the 1950s. I do think obviously those would be challenged, and I do think that what we have been watching in the last 6 months is a lot of the Republican Party that sort of sided with Trump because he was a Republican has moved away from the MAGA core. And there have been a handful of issues that surprised me, if I'm honest, on what's led them astray. Surprisingly to me, it wasn't any of these challenges to democracy. It wasn't these redistricting efforts. It was things like the overt corruption.
Okay.
It's sort of like, okay, you know, we thought you might bring about Christian nationalism, or we thought you might bring about regulatory issues that libertarians want. You know, these are sort of the bedrock beliefs of the right wing. Are we bringing about Christian values, whatever those might be? Or are we bringing about, you know, the government needs to be smaller? But instead, what a lot of people have seen is Donald Trump is doing neither of these things. He doesn't really care about either of those things. What he wants to do is just enrich himself and run the country like a mafia, where his family and his friends get wealthier. You know, it's the no bid contracts that is really turning people off. For me, the no bid contracts are what we always expected. And so this is what is really turning you off from the MAGA core. So I do think that he would encounter a lot of pushback if he decided to say, you know, these are extraordinary times and we need to overrule the amendments to the Constitution, and therefore I should run for a third term. I think also he would encounter resistance from within his own party, the people who are currently jockeying for that position, you know, the J.D. Vances or the Ted Cruzes, or some of the people who might be DeSantis, these people who might be sort of eyeing 2028 or 2032 as their time. And they want Donald Trump to just finally get out of the way so that they can continue their so-called revolution. I don't know what that will look like, obviously. I will be very interested to see what that will look like. I am hoping against hope that the Supreme Court does its job and upholds the promises of the Constitution and upholds the actions of Congress and prevents him from running and maintains our democracy. Another case that sort of flew under the radar that was decided by the Supreme Court this last week was one that continued to allow mail-in ballots. So ballots can be received up to, I think it's 4 days after an election, as long as they're postmarked before Election Day, saying that was when the Supreme Court said that was when the voters actually stamped their ballot and sent it in, and that's the moment that actually matters in our democracy. Donald Trump was, of course, trying to get rid of this because he didn't want more mail-in ballots, and the Supreme Court actually pushed back against his incursions into our democracy. So I am hopeful that the Supreme Court will continue to do that, and as conservative as the Supreme Court is, they have provided a few surprises, and especially when it comes to upholding certain aspects of elections and our ability to vote. I do also think that there would be a huge popular revolt on the streets of America if he cobbled together some baloney national emergency and tried to push himself onto the ballot box. I have friends who are Republicans. I have members who are Republicans. I have family members who have gone MAGA. You know, like probably many of our listeners. And it's been really an education for me to listen to them on how they're feeling about things when they come and go, and when they think he's doing a good job and when they don't think he's doing a good job. I do think that there would be a bleeding of support for Donald Trump if he tried to run for a third term. And I know this because when I ask them, do you think we'll have elections in 2028? They look at me like I'm insane. Of course, we're going to have elections in 2028. Of course, Donald Trump is going to step down and clear the path for some, J.D. Vance kind of person or something like that. So even within his own party, there is this notion that they expect to have normal proceedings of democracy as they've happened in the last 250 years, well, 200 years, let's say.
But I mean, like anyone that wonders why you would even be concerned about the 2028 election in that regard has to understand that Donald Trump has been so predictably unpredictable that you would have to have, you can't be naive and think that he wouldn't try and pull that or wouldn't try and go against the Constitution. And I think, looking back at the impeachment where he essentially blackmailed Ukraine to try and get the investigation on Joe Biden. And Alan Dershowitz's defense was essentially, well, if it's the will of the people, then he can do it. And then later with the Supreme Court supporting that he was able to, I think it was what the documents was the reason why they gave him immunity. And I think with just that sort of defense and that sort of Supreme Court that, like you were saying, he would declare a national emergency, or, I heard about the amendment that you could serve a third term as long as the first two were non-consecutive, any which way that they're going to go around it to try and get an 84-year-old man reelected. But I want to take it back to 2026. And I think, not to get ahead of myself and not to, predict and say that it's going to happen, but it looks as if Democrats may take back the House. And if that were the case, do you expect that they're going to try for a third impeachment trial on Donald Trump? And if they do that, do you think it's just more because they have to as a moral obligation, or do you think they're actually going to be able to get this guy out of office?
I mean, it's a really big question, and it's a really big gamble by the Democratic Party, because there's lots of ways they can go. I mean, like you said, there's a moral obligation. The guy is blatantly corrupt, and he's blatantly stealing from the American people. And I say that, from having heard it from my Republican friends and my Democratic friends. And my Democratic friends say, of course. My Republican friends say, of course. And even people are leaving the MAGA movement because of this corruption. So you talked about a moral obligation. And you'd think these Democrats, if they came in, they would want to do something that is clearly in the conscience of America. This guy is a terrible person, and he's been doing bad things to our country, and he needs to be held accountable. On the other hand, there seems to be a lot of opportunity by attacking him, which has backfired historically for the Democrats. It's given him a platform to talk about the good things that he's done. There's a sense that, this sort of Godfather-esque notion that even if it's a little bit illegal, as long as I'm doing it for the common good, then it should be okay. And why are people attacking me with their Trump derangement syndrome, the TDS that they all talk about, right? So Democrats might, I don't know what they're going to do, to answer your question. I'm a historian, not a fortune teller. I'm a historian, not a prognosticator. But I would say that there is some risk involved in doing what is the morally correct thing to do. And there are other ways that they might go about putting forward all this incredibly popular legislation, knowing that it's not going to be signed into law by him, but actually putting his ideas on trial so that then they have a platform to embarrass him and J.D. Vance or whoever it is that runs in 2028. And that will enable them maybe to have a stronger position when they actually run for president. So I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know the political calculations. I think a lot of it will depend on if there is this far left democratic socialism, the Platners of the world, if they actually succeed and get into the halls of power, how far they push. And then I also think it's going to take hard conversations within the Democratic Party to say, the elders of that party might say, we've tried this in the past, and this is the ways that it backfired. So even though it's the morally correct thing to do, we need to maybe be conscious of the risks that are involved. Are there other ways to get what we want that are more effective than giving him basically a platform and a show trial?
I think of the bicentennial in 1976. The president at the time, the only president to never be elected president, Gerald Ford, he grants a full pardon to Richard Nixon after Nixon resigns. Could you foresee that Donald Trump leaves the office in disgrace, and maybe J.D. Vance gets the presidency and gives him a full immunity or a full pardon so that Trump is not convicted of anything?
I mean, that has crossed my mind for sure, because again, Donald Trump loves power, but he's also, interested in preserving his own wealth and his own kleptocracy, basically. And so I think there is a way that he will want to protect himself over everything else. Historically, he has wanted to cling on to power too much to actually contemplate leaving office in that kind of way, brokering a deal whereby he would step down due to health reasons or whatever, provided that he got this pardon from J.D. Vance, who stepped in, and then J.D. Vance would have a perfect platform to run for his own first term in 2028. I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense strategically from a Republican perspective, but there's one big obstacle, and that's the ego that is Donald Trump. So I'm not sure that it's going to happen. But there is a world in which it could happen. I do have interesting thoughts, and I haven't landed on a conclusion yet on, was it good that Ford pardoned Nixon? Because it did allow the country to move on beyond Watergate, which was a good thing in some ways. It allowed the country to focus on real bread and butter issues during stagflation of the 1970s, when we had inflation but a stagnating economy. So prices were going up and jobs were going away, and life for the average American was suffering and on the decline. So this should be first and foremost in any politician's eye, and it was for Ford. So he wanted this whole thing to go away so that he could focus on the good of the country. But in some ways, it also never brought to task the Republican Party for its wrongdoing. And actually, one of the true beneficiaries of Watergate was the Republican Party, because it crafted and actually enshrined this narrative that all politicians are corrupt, all politicians are eager to do whatever it takes to get elected, all politicians will use the power of the state to go and break into their opponents' headquarters if they have to in order to do what they want. So we need to have small government. So the true victor of Watergate was certainly not Jimmy Carter, who rode on the soiling of the American flag in order to become president, but instead it was this sort of cynicism towards American politics. And I do think that we are still yet to recover from that cynicism. I do think that Donald Trump has been able to tap into that deep vein of cynicism in the white working class, in the recently arrived white middle class. The number one population that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 was not impoverished people, Americans, was not the sort of so-called white working class. It was white Americans who made between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. So that was a surprise when I saw that. But it made me wonder what's going on with that population. Well, they've achieved, really solid middle and upper middle class status, but they haven't yet achieved security in that status. And it was that insecurity that led them to look for a savior who was going to guarantee that they were able to hold their position there. And that was the rationale for them voting overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was able to capitalize on that mistrust of government and capitalize on the anxieties of those people. And I do think a successful Democratic politician, our next Teddy Roosevelt, to get back to your question, our next Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is going to be somebody who is able to speak on behalf of those anxieties and really talk about economics in a way that is effective and actually meets people where they are.
Dr. Kevin Schultz, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we go, it's your summer in between the spring and fall semesters. What do you like to do when you have time away from teaching?
Well, I taught summer school because I have 4 of my 5 kids are in college, so I got to come up with some way to pay some of these tuition bills. So I taught summer school, but that just finished. And now I'm reading fiction, which is really, really fun right now. I'm also contemplating my next book project, which is called The Rule of 60, which argues that Americans actually have more in common than we think. There's 20% on the far left, there's 20% on the far right, and there's the rule of 60% in the middle that basically agrees on most issues. And so I'm writing this book to test out that hypothesis.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. We'll have to have you back when that book's ready to be released.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
All right. Well, Professor Kevin Schultz, thank you so much and enjoy your holiday, okay?
All right. Thanks, Paul. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th.